Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great weekend. Today I'll be discussing Gregory Smithers' article as it relates to Julie Reed's book, Serving the Nation. So Smithers' article is on the Cherokee Diaspora and formal education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he's looking at how Cherokee education could foster or not foster a sense of cohesive national Cherokee identity. Um, his article came out around the same time as Reed's book, about a year before, and it really addresses similar themes, but he does depart from Reed's thesis in several ways. So Smithers is really taking on this idea that education reinforced the Cherokee national identity, arguing that education did not always necessarily support a cohesive sense of national pride. This contrasts to what we read with Loma Wyma's work and much of what Reed emphasizes on education's influence. To be fair, Smithers is comparing and contrasting three different schools. He's not looking at just one school, as Loma Wyma does with Shalako, and he's not looking at just the Cherokee Orphan Asylum that Reed does. So he's looking at this diaspora perspective of these three different schools, the Cherokee Orphan Asylum and really the Cherokee male and female seminaries too, the Cherokee boarding school in North Carolina near the Qualla Reservation, and also the Sherman Institute, an off-reservation boarding school in Riverside, California. He profiles these different institutions and looks at how they contributed to a sense of Cherokee national identity or fractured that identity. So first, looking at the Cherokee Orphan Asylum, which Reed covers at length in her book, Smithers writes about Walter Adair Duncan and quotes him several times, and looks at how the orphan asylum and the seminaries in what became Oklahoma produced a sense of national pride at the expense, or in spite of, in some ways, discord under the surface and sometimes on the surface over prejudice issues across racial or class lines. And we'll get into that more in a bit. He also looks at the Cherokee boarding school. As I said, it's in North Carolina. Its mission was mostly to find a solution to apparent cultural backwardness among the Eastern Band of Cherokees there through education. So looking at education as a solution, mostly driven by white, primarily Quaker teachers. It really typified this sense of gender division of curriculum and training and labor. So it undermined, according to Smithers, the sense of Cherokee Gajugai, this communal labor division. So he profiles the Sherman Institute, the off-reservation boarding school in California, as it was administered by the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs, that it was an unsupportive and unproductive institution in fostering and enriching a form of Cherokee identification. So it focused on assimilation into American economic and social life. Smithers quotes the National Education Association, stating that the Sherman Institute had an aim of teaching students how to hold their own against the whites and really erode the sense of Cherokee national identity. Smithers focuses on these schools because they reflect what life was like across the diaspora. So that's something that he really focuses on in his book, which is something that ties into themes from this article. So looking at different places and different spaces, he's asserting that scholars have not really adequately addressed Cherokee history or Native American history for that matter from a diaspora perspective. He's looking at how Cherokees were scattered away from the Southeast. So in part in the Southeast when he's looking at the Cherokee boarding school, but also looking at Cherokees in the Trans-Mississippi West, other parts of the United States, and beyond. So it's very broad, and he's looking at how this disbursement created interesting elements in how people developed and encountered their sense of identity and how they cultivated that in different ways and how that was challenged too. He cites Loma Wyma in addressing how some elements of what we see with her work and in Reed's play up the agricultural element of students' education and curriculum. Additionally, he references Miyasua's book that Melissa discussed last week with her article. Miyasua's work on the Cherokee Female Seminary, Cultivating the Rosebuds, addresses these issues of race and prejudice among students, parents, faculty, staff, and administrators in the female seminary, in the male seminary too, and in the Cherokee Orphan Asylum, and how that, in Smithers' view, really damaged this sense of a cohesive Cherokee identity, because prejudice was running rampant to a point of where a cultural mixture wasn't really something that was being appreciated or celebrated. So methodologically, Smithers pulls from different sources for this article, from primary sources on education in the Cherokee Nation from the Oklahoma Historical Society, other archival sources from the Indian Pioneer Papers and the Western Historical Collections at the University of Oklahoma, the Bureau of Indian Affairs records from the National Archives, newspapers like the Cherokee Phoenix and Cherokee Advocate, speeches, census records, and numerous secondary sources from scholars we've encountered already. I already mentioned Loma Wyma and Miyasua, but he's also looking at Taya Miles and Brenda Child and many others. So he's drawing from a pretty wide source base and making his argument. He connects pretty well to what Reed is writing, in that he centers on Duncan's view that, quote, no people in the world are better situated than the Cherokees, and that education was, in Duncan's words, the heartstring, the jeweled cord binding the nation together. He addresses the Curtis and Dawes Acts and allotment as well, and frames that in this discussion of how the Cherokee Nation's identity and cohesion confronted those acts and those challenges of settler colonialism and aggressive forms of forced assimilation, while at the same time dealing with discord within the nation and diaspora. So a big takeaway from Smithers' article is that national formal Cherokee education provided them with new ways to conceptualize identity across the board. So this is similar to what we find in Loma Wyman and Reed, but he really departs from their arguments in driving home this sense that schools like the Cherokee Boarding School in North Carolina and the Sherman Institute that I mentioned that was in California fractured Cherokee identity, and that the orphan asylum and the seminaries in Indian Territory were definitely not perfect in their aims either, because as we've seen, racism and classism really plagued their operations. As we saw in Christina Snyder's presentation and in her discussion with Rose Stremlaw, the supplemental video for this week, divisions within Native American groups over issues of race, class, culture, and more were influential just as much as allotment and the federal government's ongoing efforts to complicate Cherokee life influenced discord. So Smithers uses schools as an example of how Cherokees navigated what he deems to be a multifaceted, quote, multi-sided identity, and touches on what we've discussed so far, in part when we've talked about blood quantums and then also genealogical complexity with relationship to identity. So Reed's consistent argument throughout her book is that Cherokee self-determination, persistence, and resilience really developed these systems that shined in comparison to others. Smithers assesses how centralization and bureaucracy really forced this sense of Cherokee nationalism to the surface, and at the same time presents examples of rampant discord within the diaspora. So Reed and Smithers both allow us to continue this discussion of how Native American people were not a monolith. Not everybody agreed on everything all the time. There was disagreement, hostility, discord within groups, and that changed over time and was with regard to pretty much every matter, large and small, including education. People's motivations changed depending on what was happening in the United States in general, too, from the Civil War and beyond. So while Reed emphasizes the real sense of Native agency in driving home her point that Cherokees employed significant agency and were not simple, flat characterizations in this narrative of Native American declension and dependency on the government, Smithers overlaps with that, but then also wants to emphasize that institutions within the Cherokee Nation were not faultless either, that in their aim to develop a cohesive sense of national pride, they also undermine their efforts in allowing prejudice and classism to run rampant and to damage a sense of cohesive identity. So Smithers discusses how the Cherokee boarding school and the Sherman Institute, yes, they had definite faults in pushing for assimilation and eroding and fracturing Cherokee identity and damaging students' sense of identity or ability to cultivate a Cherokee identity. And what we've seen in Loma Wyma and Reed's work is that students navigated that and persisted in developing a sense of identity, but Smithers is saying that really so much damage was done in those capacities in those institutions, and that the Cherokee Orphan Asylum and then also both of the seminaries didn't always produce that sense of national pride that we might see on the surface level, that there was a lot going on with discord within groups. So things that I would like us to consider as we navigate our discussion of Reed this week include themes of sovereignty, persistence, prejudice, cooperation, division, and centralization. Of course, we'll go in many different directions in our discussion. I'm looking forward to discussing that with you all, and I hope that you have a great rest of the weekend. Thanks for watching my presentation on Smithers, and I will see y'all soon.